So it is an amazing privilege to be part of this discussion, and there couldn't have been a better bridge to what I'm talking about in the last panel, because so my name is Kristina Dziekan, and for the past 20 years in my professional career, I've lived and breathed market access. So I've worked in the pharmaceutical and medical device industry, making sure that the innovations get to the patient in a timely manner, with the right reimbursement, guidelines, and all the enablers for appropriate adoption of the therapies in the marketplace. And so part of that work in the past has been on neuromodulation market access. And more recently, I'm also on the board of Onward, which is the company that is bringing the neuromodulation technologies for spinal cord injury patients to market. That's the innovations that Professor Damasio talked about yesterday morning, led by Grégoire Courtine and Jocelyn Bloch in Lausanne, to really figure out how to help restore movement in SCI patients. So market access. We have a lot of terms flying around about that, so let me define what I understand by market access, and then peel back and decode a little bit the steps that I believe are needed, especially when we're creating new frontiers, as what we've been talking about in neuroscience. So market access, to me, is all the activity that needs to happen once regulatory approval is in place for a technology, to make sure that that innovation is paid for in the appropriate way and integrated in patient care pathways, so that really, in the end, the right patients get timely access to the technologies. And actually, I realize I don't have a clicker, so thanks. So a big question, that came up also in the panel is, okay, if we want to make a technology in a market commercially viable, how do we get it paid? How do we get it reimbursed by the insurance companies or by the governments in a particular market? And I will give you a few pointers, but I'll argue that is much too narrow a question to ask, and we need to think a lot bigger in the way we orchestrate, it was referred to as the ecosystem for decision-making that allows the responsible use. So starting with the simple question of how do we get a technology paid? Well, if there's already a similar technology or procedure in the market, then actually it's a fairly straightforward benchmarking on what already exists. And if we talk about deep brain stimulation, for example, anything new that comes out in deep brain stimulation will be benchmarked on what is already out there in the market. So payers will want to look at, okay, does this new technology offer greater patient benefits, do it more efficiently, more safely, and any changes in the procedure of how to make it happen, and it will be compared and benchmarked, and usually the funding is very closely related to what is already being paid for existing DBS technologies. So it makes it sound very, very easy. It's still a complex process, market by market, figuring out what exactly the payer wants to see when you submit for a reimbursement application, but at least it's plannable. So let me give you the illustration from Onward. So Onward is developing a spinal cord stimulation technology for spinal cord injury patients. And of course, there's spinal cord stimulation out in the market. So the expectation has to be that a starting point for submitting for and negotiating reimbursement will be benchmarked on that, which may be really helpful because arguably it can shorten the time to market and the time to reimbursement. But we very quickly reach a limit of that trodden pathway. For example, if we then later bring to market brain-computer interface, but there's no established category for the reimbursement of brain-computer interfaces, what does that mean? How will payers start to think about that new, what they perceive as an add-on to an established therapy, but really it starts revolutionizing the therapeutic space in very different ways. So unless we break it down to the payer before and establish a category, for example, around brain-computer interface and what that does in the way patients will experience the therapy, payers will be lost. And in all likelihood, there will be no or very little incremental reimbursement for what that technology brings. So I think this is just to open the mind that, collectively, we have to create the future we want to see, or, to use your terminology, start aligning the stars that allow to really define what that new frontier in the neuroscience space looks like for our patients. So in that new space, it's really about thinking about orchestrating what is a decision-making ecosystem. Because as a payer, to decide on, can I fund, these amazing innovations that are coming, they'll be completely overwhelmed by the complexity. And they will be looking for guidelines and for benchmarks that help them decide what they should pay for, how much, and how. And a payer will not move unless there is a policy recommendation or a prioritization from a policy perspective that, yes, this is an area we want to invest in our healthcare delivery, it is important to us. And unless there are guardrails of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable in our healthcare system. And the same, the payer will look to the clinician to say, are you convinced of the scientific merit and the benefits to the patients that you will actually, as a clinician, integrate it into your treatment pathways? And if so, are you adjusting guidelines accordingly? Once clinical guidelines are adjusted, again, reimbursement is so much easier to follow because there is an evidence-based recommendation. And the same for patients. What are the outcomes benefits? What are the benefits for the patient that make it easy for the patient to accept, integrate, adopt a new therapeutic approach? And only if those stars are aligned, the payer will decide, okay, here's how we can think about reimbursing this technology. And the example of the DIGAs came up, and I think it's a really important analogy to use in our context, and that is the digital health applications. So when they started coming to market, a few years ago, actually there was no established reimbursement mechanism, and as a result, adoption was on a private pay basis. Now that may be commercially viable or not, but is it desirable? Probably not, because there's a huge potential to integrate those apps into treatment pathways and for clinicians to actually prescribe the use of a health app in a certain area. So while digital apps were regulated under the MDR and could enter the market, reimbursement was not automatic. And so the German healthcare system took the lead in a way and said, well, actually, we believe in the benefits to our healthcare delivery of digital health apps. Let's figure out to create the policy imperatives and guidance that make them reimbursable. So the German authorities created the DVG Act, which specifies what categories of healthcare apps could be integrated and reimbursed in the German healthcare system. It defined the functionality that was required for evaluation, and it defined how to evaluate the benefits and risks of such an application for it to be reimbursable. And with that, it opened the doors for payers to engage in a structured process with companies around the reimbursement of digital health apps. And I see a lot of parallels for us here. So if we think about future-proofing the access for the technologies and innovations we're talking about here, we need to think about what does it take in the public space to establish the right categories, describe the functionalities and the impact on the patient on healthcare delivery, and what are the right benefits to evaluate to make sure that there is a proven path forward. So really, it is about backwards engineering, I would call it. You start with a vision of what future care for patients with neurological disorders will look like once the technologies we're talking about are being adopted. And that's really about simplifying that vision in very, very practical terms. And it's hugely exciting to look at that together. And some of those vision statements came up in the panel earlier, and I think it is, that is when transformation of healthcare delivery happens. And it's vision in terms of, in 5 or 10 years from now, we would expect that 50% of the patients who currently are treated with invasive technologies in hospital will actually be able to shift their care to a home and, or be, functionally rehabilitated much sooner than currently. It's establishing the vision of what if we get things right, this is the potential. And then breaking it down into, so if we're successful, the patient benefit that we measure in functionality, in patient-reported outcomes, in quality of life, in other aspects that are meaningful, the patient benefit should be that. The safety improvements could be this, but it's also about sustainability and responsibility. So how do we make sure to explain that the changes we can help make lead to a much more efficient and better use of healthcare resources, a big concern for decision makers. And how will the whole care pathway have to change? The shift from inpatient to outpatient, for example, from high-intensity clinician care to a different form of rehabilitation care, for example. And exactly what stakeholders need to be involved to make it happen. And increasingly, we're in an area where it's the non-traditional stakeholders, like around technology, around AI, and civil society as well, given all the ethical questions we have, need to be involved in the discussion and the debate. So really, it's a multi-stakeholder, and I would call it a democratic process, to figure out what is acceptable along the way for society. And this sounds super abstract, but actually it is helping to bring the wonderful ideas and the wonderful science into something that ultimately will help transform care delivery. And I want to break it down in some practical considerations. We talked a lot about the need for collaboration along the way. So what could that look like? And one suggestion was, well, we need an individual, expert who waves the flag from a policy perspective. Well, I would argue that is super helpful, but it needs collective effort. And Joy yesterday mentioned the concept of private-public partnership. Increasingly, that is an important platform to think about structuring the right dialogue, setting appropriate goals, and establishing an iterative process for market access to build trust and create an ecosystem that is adaptive to whatever is coming. So concretely, what could that look like? I've given potential partnership models to this group to think about, because I think this is an interesting nucleus of experts to think about what can you relate to, or what can you find common ground on that might help move this debate forward. And a simple starting point is to collaborate on an information repository. Every one of the startups will start looking at, okay, for my technology, what are the relevant policies, what is the go-to-market, what are the reimbursement systems, who are the key players, where do I need to engage, and what are the evidence standards I need to apply in my pivotal trials. Well, that is not necessarily a competitive space, but it's the same questions everyone will ask. And if there's collaboration to establish something like an ongoing monitoring, mapping, alert system, everyone can benefit. And then that is the knowledge base you can turn into other actions. And at the bottom here, I've just given links, if you want to click through it, to efforts that have collated public-private perspectives into resource kits that help be the foundation for further action. The next point is collaborating around establishing what evidence standards should be like for those technologies we're looking at. what should be collected in a pivotal trial to inform decision making, and what are the data standards for interoperability to make sure that all the various efforts start creating a big picture that helps guide decision making. Or you may want to go as far as thinking about, if we establish the infrastructure that allows interoperability for data, what would that need to look like? That we have almost an ongoing registry or data repository or data network in market that allows us to iterate and learn much faster altogether. A third is around categorizing and setting standards. I mentioned earlier, like for the DIGAs, there are some efforts around brain-computer interfaces, etc., to start setting standards, but what is the role collectively, this group or others can play in making that translational and referenceable in the marketplace? And finally is the policy. Is there common ground? Are there common goals to prioritize engagement, like writing a white paper on how policy ought to think about integrating brain-computer interfaces? And there are some discussions around that, but from my experience, they're still incredibly fragmented, and there could be a huge benefit. So to wrap up, lots of illustrations on what has happened in other medical fields that I hope provide food for thought. But if we're advancing access through private-public partnership, which is what I think you've gathered I strongly advocate for, it starts with a common vision, common goals, and breaking that down into a commitment. How ready is this group or other groups to collaborate differently on those topics? And commit resources to it, and how deeply would you be willing to go? What's the scope? Is it joint information gathering, or moving all the way to joint advocacy? What is the regional focus? There is an argument about you could start in Spain, like DIGAS did in Germany, and build a prototype of what a good market access kind of roadmap could look like for the technologies, and bring that into Europe as an inspiration. And who else needs to be around the table for that? A couple of really important stakeholder groups that are missing from this forum are payers and patients, to integrate into the discussions, to make sure that we capture all the opinions, and defining the governance, the right processes into an evolutionary model. But I think this is a lot of food for thought, hopefully, to trigger further discussion about not expecting others to solve it for us, but to say, we are actors in this. How do we design the future we want to see? Thanks a lot.